opened, Italian rents fell 6 points, and their allies weakened in proportion. The smash had come. Italy was bankrupt, and the Triple Alliance would fall to pieces. It all arose from a dispatch and an editorial in the columns of the London Thunderer, those columns which were held to be as infallible as the multiplication table itself. This was the dispatch. Italy, from our own correspondent. I saw Signor Crespo this evening, and learned from him that the new and important item in the budget, the new source of revenue which has been promised and upon which great hopes have been based, will take the form of a national tax upon mustaches. In his bill, which he will introduce in the chamber tomorrow, it will be provided that every citizen of Italy wearing a mustache shall pay a sumptuary tax thereupon of 1 lira yearly. In the ordinary course, this tax will yield the 20 million lira per annum which are so greatly needed and whose source up to now it has been impossible to discover. Of course, a certain amount of opposition from the left is confidently to be expected. The tax on mustaches will undoubtedly afford an opportunity to the socialists to champion individual rights and protest against interference therewith. But, on the other hand, the clerical wing are certain to view the innovation with favor. The popular acceptation of the measure is, however, difficult to forecast. This was probably the most nonsensical dispatch that has ever appeared in any newspaper, great or small. The editor had looked at it incredulous. The leader writer said, it's neck or nothing with Crespo. Only Vincent's cipher and the condition of Italy made belief possible, but it was believed. This was the editorial. The extraordinary course which has been adopted by the Prime Minister of Italy in order to replenish the national treasury is so radical an extension of the general principle of taxation that neither its wisdom nor its result can yet be declared with any degree of certainty. Statistics do not unfortunately furnish us with the number of Italian citizens who at the period of the last census were wearing mustaches. It is a well-known fact, however, that the custom of cultivating hair in an ornamental form upon the upper lip is perhaps more firmly established as a national habit in Italy than in any other country of the world at the present time. The first lesson of this proposed legislation is its certain indication of the extreme, if not hopeless, financial straits into which the monarchy has fallen. The second is the very doubtful character of the tax itself as a reliable source of revenue, when viewed from the standpoints of expediency and of successful enforcement. It will be necessary for legislation to establish with perfect clearness not only what a mustache legally is, but also at what age, both of the wearer and of the mustache itself, it becomes taxable. And in these two directions, to say nothing of the popular acceptance or rejection of the measure, the visible difficulties are both many and great. On that very afternoon, a man in a yachting suit went over the side of a yacht at Naples and was rowed to the pier. He was happy and buoyant with the buoyant happiness of the man who loved and is loved. Upon reaching the pier, he bought the second edition of the Corriere di Napoli and glanced at the telegraph columns. The Thunderer dispatch had been cabled back to Naples, and under sensational headlines was the first to meet his eye. His first thought was that he was losing his mind and inventing the telegram. Then something flashed upon him, and his heart seemed to stop beating. He staggered to the curb of the pier, sat down, and shut his eyes. He was never sure afterwards whether he fainted or not. For 5 minutes he knew only the silent whirl of agonized thoughts. He grasped at once what had happened. It was Halliday's work, and Halliday had ruined him. The Thunderer was the laughingstock of Europe, and he, as the responsible sender of that dispatch, was journalistically done for. Ambition spoke first, and the pain was of the bitterest. Love spoke next, but with all his rage and despair, he could not find the power to be harsh to Miss Belmayne. "The dear girl," he said. "She did her best, and that scoundrel fooled her completely. Oh!" And he squeezed his head with his hands as if to shut out the thought of his position and the inevitable consequences that he must face. A little knot of loungers had gathered, his evident pain exciting their sympathy. This recalled him to himself, and he took a cab and drove away. Little knots of men stood in front of the cafes excitedly discussing the new tax. Half of them were clean-shaven for the first time in their lives, and the rest were about to be. There was a run on every hairdresser's shop in Naples. The Italian is poor, the taxes are killing, and the art of dodging them is the first thing taught to children. Vincent still held the paper and now read its comments on the tax. They combined a scream of sarcastic laughter with a howl of furious rage. Italy had been touched on the spot that was tenderest. But, and here was a gleam of hope, the reputation of the Thunderer was so high that the dispatch had been taken seriously. The cell had not yet been exposed. If only Crespo would save him, but no, Crespo's position, already imperiled by a crisis, was worse than his own. Crespo would want to shoot him on the spot. He got the 2:40 train and rode to Rome in a state of numbness. What he would do to Halliday he did not dare to think. He was a man in a rage, a hungry, thirsty rage that threatened to overpower him. Nor did he dare to go to his apartment. There lay the telegram dismissing him in derision and contempt. In his sorrow, his heart turned to love for consolation. Arrived at Rome, he drove to the hotel, entered Miss Balmain's drawing room with a white, sad face, and sat in the shadow. The acting correspondent came in, radiant, beaming with pride and pleasure over her shrewdness and success. "Have you seen it? It's in the Roman papers. You didn't get beaten. Oh, I was so worried and so happy when I knew you were safe." She stopped, mystified in his silence. Then she saw his pallor and his expression. "Are you ill? What is it? What's the matter?" He tried to spare her, tried to pass the matter over lightly, but the moment she knew that the dispatch had caused his trouble, all subterfuges were useless. Her face, too, grew white, and she kept on asking him question after question till she fully understood the effect of what she had done. His ruin was certain, and his replies were gentle, quiet, and full of sympathy. Then the society girl known as Miss Balmain disappeared, and the woman in her came out. His career was ended, and through his love for her. His big, beautiful girl stood up, tried to say she was sorry, but couldn't. Her lips only quivered and wouldn't work. Then she sat down, bolt upright on the sofa, and the tears came first creeping and then tumbling down her eyelashes as she cried, broken-hearted, without a word or a handkerchief. He tried to soothe her, to say it was nothing. "Oh, Edward," was all she said. In spite of his grief, he observed the word Edward. Upon this interesting and unconventional social tableau busted in Papa Balmain of Chicago, millionaire and newspaper correspondent. He saw a white young man and a young person bathed in tears. What's the matter?" he said, starting and peering over his eyeglasses. "I'm done for, but it's all my own fault," said the young man. Papa inquired and was told. He sat down suddenly in a state of collapse. "If that sneak comes here again, I'll cowhide him," he said, exploding. "I'll thrash him anyhow, anyhow!" he roared, with the rage of an honest man who had been beaten at his own game. Then several minutes of sad, solemn silence ensued, each trying to find a ray of light in the gloom. "Why don't you see Crespo? He's a friend of yours, isn't he?" said Balmain. "He has been." "Then come on. Laura, you come with us. We did it. We're responsible, and we'll take the blame. Crespo is the only man that can save you. Here, order me a carriage," he shouted to the maid. The combative financier, who had faced and won 100 battles that were real battles, was not to be daunted by a prime minister and a newspaper and a little thing like this. His courage, of course, infected his daughter. With father at the helm, everything would, of course, be all right. It must be all right. So she hoped once more and darted away for hatpins. While waiting for her and the hatpins at the elevator, another thing occurred. Balmain put his hand in a friendly way on Vincent's shoulder and said, "Young man, don't you worry. If you have to give up journalism, you may possibly do much better than that. I know you and I like you." Vincent nodded quietly. The implied promise was well meant, but it did not appeal to him just then. They drove to the Quirinal Hall in silence. The acting correspondent merely asked her father if her hat was on straight. She secretly proposed to take the Prime Minister by storm. "Now, During all these woeful occurrences, Chance, which, as everybody knows, is the Prime Minister of Providence, was playing tricks upon another Prime Minister, the temporary ruler of Italy. Signor Crespo was at his wits' end over the new tax measures. In order to pass them, he had to yield to the demands of the socialist anarchist wing of his party, and if he failed to pass them, he fell from power. One alternative was as distasteful as the other, and he was rapidly growing gray in his efforts to find a way out of the dilemma. When the Thunderer dispatch was brought him, he jumped to his feet in amazement. Then he scratched his head and said, "Ah!" Then he smiled a smile of joy. He foresaw something. 2 minutes afterwards, the double doors of his private room were burst open, and a portly marquis, one of his enemies in the cabinet, rushed in and said, "Crespo, for heaven's sake!" The Prime Minister said nothing. Other high politicians in his party, rivals and enemies, rushed in and cried, "Crespo, for heaven's sake!" Signor Crespo said nothing. The king sent a noble duke, hot-footed, to say, "Crespo, for heaven's sake!" The Prime Minister still said nothing, but in different words. In half an hour they were all on their knees, all the opposing elements he had spent months in trying to combine. They accepted the tax on mustaches as a fact, and saw that, in revenge on them, he was going to ruin the party. They begged him not to propose it. He consented, on conditions. They agreed abjectly to his terms, told him to count on their votes, and when the chamber met, passed his budget, which they had previously agreed to defeat by a huge majority. This is why the Prime Minister, who had made inquiries, was also eager to see the acting correspondent who had sent the dispatch. Being a devout man, however, he looked upon the real sender as Providence. The carriage party entered the ministry. To Vincent, it seemed to be wrapped in accusing gloom. It was his farewell to the Prime Minister, both as a friend and correspondent. Nevertheless, he wrote on his card, with Mr. and Miss Belmain, to explain that dispatch. They were silently ushered in and stood in the great man's presence, 3 drooping figures, guilty and downcast. Belmain was not happy. He was not used to cringing before anyone. Laura's eyes were full of new tears. She would sway no more nations, whatever the temptation. Vincent was pale and grave. For some reason, the Prime Minister began to laugh. He had not felt like laughing for 3 months, and he enjoyed the feeling. He laughed till the tears came into his eyes. Vincent was angry. "Does it strike you as comical?" he said. "Comical? It's providential. See here," said Signor Crespo, pointing to a pile of at least 100 telegrams. "All Europe wants information about your dispatch. I mean Miss Belmain's dispatch," he said, bowing gracefully. "Then you understand what happened?" "Yes." "And of course you've exposed it." "Oh no. They thought I meant it. It has saved the situation." "What?" said Vincent, thunderstruck. "And in return, my friend, I have saved you. The Thunderer, unable to get any answer from you, telegraphed me for endorsement. I sent this. The Thunderer, London. In consequence of concessions from opposing elements, I shall not present my proposed tax on mustaches. Crespo." "By Jove!" said Vincent. "Edward!" screamed somebody. "Hurrah!" said Belmain. And Edward's arms were filled with sudden millinery, and 2 hearts were filled with deepest joy. 2 events of different kinds succeeded. Halliday was abused by the National for missing the most important news of the year. When he gave a true explanation of the matter, he was scoffed at. It was visibly false. He then proceeded to turn to a pale but not unbecoming green color. The doctors said liver. The cause was unrequited love. The other event was a social function of a happy, even hilarious character at the Grand Hotel. This is not of importance, however, in a country where orange blossoms are indigenous. End of Section 1, Bloomington, 4/22/2024.